Hello, everyone. What we want to do today is return to our Canadian Income Survey data and the files that we were writing in earlier videos and get to building this histogram. Now, this looks very similar to figure 1.3 in your Benjamin and co-authors labor market economics textbook. In our first video, we put together a file that would allow us to bring in that data and build some basic summary statistics. What we want to do now is actually build this histogram. So I'm going to return to Stata here and what we were doing earlier. We have Stata open. We had built this file, Stata CIS demo. You might notice this version looks a little bit nicer. I always like to have my programs with some preliminary information available. I start by defining my globals at the top, begin my log so that I can save my output in a file without having to copy and paste everything all the time, bring in the data. Here is where we defined which individuals we wanted to keep in our sample and created that hourly wage variable. Now what we want to do here in our next step is to create that histogram. Now, creating graphs in Stata is something I think comes with a lot of practice. It's something where you should really just find other people's code and go from building it from there. It's sort of a trial and error and getting everything to work. Now, when we run this basic do file to bring in our data as a starting point, we have our data loaded. We see all of our variables here on the right-hand side. We could just simply try building the simplest histogram to start. So for instance, if I were to just say, let's do histogram with our average wage variable that we've created here and run that, what happens is you get the ugliest graph you could ever imagine, and all of Stata's defaults are horribly ugly. Now here we have individuals with hourly wages between, something very close to zero, and there's probably a couple of individuals out here at the $8,000 or over $6,000. And so clearly this isn't a graph that's representing the information that we're trying to understand. So one thing we have to do, of course, is to use weights in our histogram when we build that the same way we do with our summary statistics. One thing I will just go ahead and tell you is that when you're building a histogram, Stata does not like weights that have any decimal places, and our weights do. So one thing that I do just to start that off is to create a weight where I round up that F weight variable that we have available. And what that will do is create an integer that is rounded to the nearest whole number, and that will work for us. Then what we can do is, add the weight command into our command line for the histogram. And what I would like to do is say, well, let's just map out the people who have wages between $5 and $100 per hour. And that's just going to help us focus in a little bit more on the individuals that we think we're interested in. One thing we can also do is add in a bit of code here to say how wide we want each of those bins to be in the histogram. And instead of presenting us with this density number, which I think is very unintuitive to most people, we're going to put in the fraction of our population that fits into each bin. And so once we just bring in even just a few lines of code there to make this simpler, it looks a lot better. But again, I think Stata's default is incredibly ugly. It's got this bluish gray black background. All of the bars are this weird sandy gold color. Our titles don't make any sense. We need to pretty this up a little bit. And so, one thing you can do is try to find people's code to figure out how to do this. You can do it in the graph editor directly in Stata, but it's not going to save that information for you. So you'd have to redo that every time you have to fix your graph. And if you have any experience in your courses, you're probably going to have to do this over a few times before you get it right. So here what I've done is I've said, well, let's put in a title on the x-axis and call this average hourly earnings instead of this AVG wage variable. Let's label our y-axis as well for that fraction of individuals. And we're going to format the numbers and make sure that they're horizontal instead of everyone having to look sideways. We're also going to decide which labels, which numbers do we want to actually have everyone see when we're looking at that x-axis. We get rid of the bluish gray background just by changing the graph region's color. And we can change the color of the bars both its fill color and the line color that goes around each bar with these simple commands here. And if you go into the help menu with Stata, you can find out a lot more. Just say help histogram, look at the options, and you can get the full listings of these colors by clicking through a few screens. Now, one thing I also want to add to this graph, if you remember from our presentation in our notes, is some information about the distribution. So here, from our summary statistics, I've added in lines for that 10th percentile, the 50th percentile or median earnings, average earnings, or average hourly earnings, and also that 90th percentile. Okay, so that's going to put in some vertical lines for us. And then finally, of course, we want to save this. We want to be able to tuck that away into our EC306 folder for later use. And here I've called it wages. If you don't put anything on the end here, it's going to save it as a Stata graph, GPH. And we want to make sure that we add that we need to replace that every time we run this do file. Otherwise, you will run into errors that it's not going to let you overwrite things. So now when we run this again, and we can run it from the start or just run that histogram, we get a much better looking graph, right? It looks a bit more intuitive. We have labels that make sense, numbers we can read, and we can take a look at it this way. Now, one thing you'd want to do, of course, is be able to export that to a format that is easier to copy and paste or insert into, say, a Word document or something online, other things you want to use. So for instance, here, what I will do is export that file right out to that EC306 folder where I want it. I'm still going to call it wages, but you can call it whatever you want. And I'm going to add here .png, and that's going to tell it to write it as a PNG file. What you can also do is just tell it in the options for this as PNG, save it that way. And as usual, we're going to need to replace anything that was already existing. If nothing's there, it just writes it and goes ahead with the file. Now, at the end of this, of course, I want to make sure that I close my log so that it saves my results somewhere for me. And then I will run that. And we have a much nicer looking graph. You can go ahead and further edit it if you want to in this graph editor, but again, that doesn't get saved in your do file. And when we go back to that folder where we were saving everything, we now have a new text file for all of our results. We have the Stata graph that we can open up and edit again later on if we want to. And we have that PNG file that we can easily insert into any other documents. So those are the basics of how to create a histogram. You can look up all sorts of graph commands with very similar options for all of them for making better graphs in Stata. There you go.